said, my name is Mary Sutton. I'm the Citrus Extension Specialist with the University of Georgia. And I started this role about a year ago, but my background is in citrus down in Florida. And so I thought for today we would just kind of do a crash course on growing citrus here in the cold hardy region. So we're just going to jump right into kind of getting established and getting your trees going. And the first step in that is figuring out what you want to grow. As we'll see today, there are literally hundreds of different citrus varieties, most of which Herschel has here. So you should be able to see most of them. And with our citrus, we can really divide those into two main categories: the sweet types, which are like the mandarin, sweet oranges, grapefruit, and then the acid types, which are kumquats, calamondins, and lemons and limes. And while it's really important, you want your sweet or you want your acid fruit, but with where we live, we really need to consider the cold hardiness of these different types. And there is a very general ranking of the types of all the different types of citrus. So the kumquats tend to be our most cold hardy, whereas like the lemons, limes, and citrons are the least. And again, this is a very general ranking, so it's not that every single mandarin is going to be more cold hardy than every single sweet orange. But again, this is just a general ranking. So once you've picked out your variety and you think it's going to be pretty good for your region, the next thing is to pick out the right spot in your yard or in your field. Citrus really hates to have wet feet, so it's really important to have an area that's very well drained. So you want to avoid any low areas in your yard where that water might accumulate. Because not only is that going to be really bad for the roots, that's also a really good spot for disease to kind of fester and just put your trees at more of a risk. You also really want to avoid planting near any septic tanks. The roots can plug up the drainage for your septic tank, and trust me, you do not want to deal with a clogged septic tank. You also want to plant it near a protective structure. So for a lot of folks, that's going to be the south side of a house or a barn, just something that's going to protect it from those incoming northern winds, because that's where the worst of our cold usually comes from. You can also plant them near large trees. These are again going to act as a windbreak and will provide a little extra protection during the cold. Okay. You also want to plant them in partial to full sun. Citrus is going to prefer a lot of sun, but if you do plant it under these large trees, they will be partially shaded, and again, that's going to provide extra protection. But because they're shaded, you're going to have that is going to affect your photosynthesis, so they might not be as productive as a fully sunned tree. But again, if this is a backyard tree, you might not care that you're not getting 400 pounds of fruit. 300 might be more than enough for your family. And then with some of our very susceptible varieties, you will want to think about keeping it in a pot so you can bring it in and outside every winter. So this is an 8-year-old lemon tree that my parents have, and so every winter it gets to come in, sit by the fire, have its own grow light. They added a humidifier this last year because it was drying out too much. So this is a very spoiled lemon. It's never produced a fruit, but it's very happy. So yeah, it's part of the family now. So you do have to really be careful with some of these super cold susceptible varieties because they are going to need a lot of babying. All right, so once you kind of know what you want to do with your tree, where you're going to put it, now you got to make sure that site is ready for that tree. And the first or the most important step for that is to check your soil. Check to make sure the pH is good, the fertility is where you want it at. And for our pH, you want it between 6 and 6.5. And so, at least here in Georgia, you can talk to your local extension agent about taking a soil sample and sending it off for analysis, and that will really get you everything you need as far as getting your soil ready. And then once you kind of make sure your soil is ready, you also really need to think about the spacing of your trees, and that's really going to depend on your variety and rootstock. So we have dwarfing rootstocks, so they're going to stay much smaller. You can usually put those 6 to 10 feet apart, or you can also put those a little closer to other structures. Whereas if you have a full-size citrus tree, those you want to be 10 to 20 feet apart or away from any big structures. And you also want to think about the height of the tree. I've seen trees anywhere from 6 to 8 feet tall to 30 plus feet. So, and again, that's going to be very dependent on your variety. Okay, so now the most important part. You figured out everything you want, now you got to actually get your tree. And it's super duper important to only buy from USDA certified nurseries like Herschel's here. And this is going to prevent importing diseases and insects. We'll talk about some of those quarantine diseases that we want to keep out of the state. And we know that we have several certified nurseries that ship by mail, like Herschel's here. I know Georgia, Texas, and I think, I think there's several other nurseries outside of Georgia that will ship. And generally when you purchase a tree from a nursery, that tree is going to be between 1 and 2 years old, and you can kind of tell that based on how thick the trunk is. All right, so once you finally got your tree, it's time to put it in the ground. And the best time to do that is after the cold weather is over. So generally we say between April and July. This way you're not planting it when there's still a chance of a late frost, but you're also making sure that tree has plenty of time to get established before we get any cold weather that next winter. You want to make sure you have time for those roots to get established and that tree to really make itself at home there, so that way when we do have cold weather, it's as healthy and happy as can be. And when we go to plant our trees, we want to make sure that it can actually fit down in that root, into the hole you've dug. You don't want to leave too much extra space because you end up with a lot of air pockets that can allow water to kind of accumulate around the roots, which is just not good. And if it's too tight, you're really compressing those roots, which is also not good. The other big thing, which we kind of talked about yesterday, you do not want to put fertilizer down in the planting hole. That is a really good way to burn your roots. The other really important thing is to make sure the graft union is above the soil line. So with a lot of our rootstocks, we're selecting for disease tolerance, disease resistance. So if you select this rootstock that is, let's say, tolerant to Phytophthora, but your scion's not, if you plant it so that the scion is underground, you're kind of negating having that really powerful rootstock. So it's super important that that graft union stays above the soil line. And with most of our nurseries, the trees are already going to be pruned to the appropriate size. So you'll very rarely have to prune the tree after you've received it, but you should expect your trees to be kind of short when you do receive them. You also want to keep an area of about 4 feet in diameter, free of any weeds and grass. Especially when the trees are young, those weeds and grass will compete with your citrus tree's root system, and will just make it harder for that tree to get established and make itself at home. You also want to plan to water about twice weekly and then cut back to weekly once the tree's gotten pretty well established. And if you're getting a ton of rainfall, you aren't going to need that supplemental water. But again, it's just kind of pampering this tree to make sure it can make itself at home. And so during those first 3 years, you want to make sure to remove any fruit that's set on the tree. During these years, we really want to focus on getting the tree established. And we want to make sure all of the tree's resources are being sent to the vegetative growth, not fruit. And usually with juvenile trees, the fruit's not very good anyway. So yes, you might have 4 or 5 fruit on that tree, but it'd be much more worthwhile if that energy was going to new leaves versus those few fruit. And during these first couple of years, you can use pretty fertilizers like a 10-10-10 or 8-8-8 that have secondary macronutrients and micronutrients mixed in, just to make sure the tree is getting everything it might need. And you want to fertilize an area that is twice the diameter of the canopy to promote root growth. Because if you put all of your fertilizer right there around the trunk, not only are you probably going to burn your roots, but you're also telling the tree, my food is only going to be in this very small space, and so you'll end up with this super dense root ball that's not going to be as structurally sound as a nice established root system. We also recommend cutting off fertilizer by, this says August 1st. You might can push it as late as the end of August, but we want to make sure the trees have plenty of time to slow down in growth before we get into the winter. And so anytime you put out a heavy fertilizer application, that's usually going to trigger a flush. And so if you put fertilizer out on, let's say, October 31st, it's going to take about a month for that flush to be triggered, and another 30 to 45 days before that flush is hardened off. And so what that means, if we had another cold snap like we did this year, you've got a lot of tender flesh on the tree that is going to get burnt back by any freeze. So we just want to make sure the tree has plenty of time to slow down and get ready for the winter. And like we talked yesterday, you don't always necessarily have to do a granular fertilizer. There are, you can do like fertigation or foliar nutrient sprays to help supplement. And that's very common with some of the secondary and micronutrients. And for our commercial guys, we really recommend doing your nutrient analysis in August. That way you can kind of see where your tree's at the end of the season and make plans for the next season. And I recommend the same for homeowners as well. And so in August, you can take a soil sample as well as a leaf sample to send off for nutrient quantification. And that will really give you a good idea of where your tree's at, because not only will it tell you what's available in the soil, but it will also tell you what your tree's actually been able to take up and use. And so something we see pretty commonly is that the calcium levels in the soil are phenomenal. They're optimal or even higher, whereas when you go to look at the leaf nutrient, it might be low or even deficient in calcium. So that way we know, even though we have calcium, the tree isn't taking it up and isn't using it. So we know we got to supplement some way other than our granular fertilizer. And so again, all of this is just a good way to figure out what you need to do for the next year. All right, so for the first couple years, you really won't need to do a whole lot of pruning. At this point, we're just really trying to get those trees to grow up and be as big and established as possible. You might want to do a little bit of training if you see a weird limb or something, just to make sure it becomes the shape you want. But the biggest thing is to make sure you remove any rootstock suckers that are emerging. And those guys will come out fast, and they can take over a tree even faster. And you definitely do not want a rootstock tree because they are usually very thorny. The fruit is super seedy, and usually the fruit is not very tasty either. So all around, just not the tree you want. So that's really one of the most important things to do in those first couple years. Then after that, once your tree really starts getting some size on it, you can expect fruit in maybe year 4 or 5. Sorry. You want to continue fertilizing with an 888 or 10-10-10 or your fertilizer of choice. You definitely want to target any deficiencies in the spring with your secondary or micronutrient applications. And the rule of thumb we've been using is to use half a pound of 888 for every year of the tree. That's a very general rule of thumb. You definitely want to go off of what your tissue and soil analysis are. Because we've seen a lot of times with that, your nitrogen is going to be absolutely great, probably on the high side, so you might not need to put out quite as much in those years. And again, we want to keep the pH between 6 and 7, and we want to continue keeping that area under the tree weed and grass free. And as the tree gets older, we really just want to focus on that kind of 12-inch area around the trunk. And largely, you just need to water as needed. During flowering and fruit set is going to be a particularly important time, as this is when the tree is going to need a lot of its water. You don't want to add any additional stress during this time to make sure you're getting the best fruit set possible. You also want to plan to prune maybe late spring to early summer. You want to avoid that final frost date, but you also don't want to wait too long because then you're pruning out a ton of your actually set fruit. So this one is very variety specific. You'll just have to go off of when your tree is expected to bloom. And for pruning, it really is up to you how you want to shape it. So like in this picture, it's a satsuma tree that's very gangly, and it's just been kind of given the freedom to grow in the shape it wants. Here's a sweet orange tree from, I believe this is down in Florida, where they've kind of formed them into these really nice, pretty ball shapes. And in California, we saw some beautiful hedges. So they let the trees get nice and big, and then cut them all as one so it forms these really beautiful hedges. So again, it's really up to you how you want to shape it, but generally you want to keep the limbs off of the ground just so that the fruit's not touching the ground, because that's another good way for diseases to get established. All right, so probably the most important thing is protecting these trees during the winter. And with any freeze protection, it needs to be implemented before the temperatures drop below freezing. And you want to remove the fruit before that chance of freeze, because the fruit's going to be very sensitive to cold, and if that fruit gets a chance to freeze, you're not going to want it after the fact. It's going to get mushy and not very pleasant. And so the hope is that your fruit will be ready by the time we get our first hard freeze. And like we've seen at the Lomax plot, we did see that the trees that had all the fruit removed did hold up better during a really hard freeze compared to trees where we left fruit on them. So it's also just to help protect the tree. And this seems a little counterintuitive, but you also don't want any really tall weeds or grass below the tree. While that will provide a little insulation, what it's really going to do is lock in the cold air. So that cold air will stay around the tree, around the trunk, instead of being able to drain out of the field or out of your yard. So it's really important to kind of keep the area clear. And as for active ways of protecting the tree, this is probably more popular among homeowners. You can form these soil banks that would cover the graft union. It's really important to use clean soil for this and to remove the soil bank as soon as the threat of freeze is over. Because kind of like we talked about earlier, your scion's going to be susceptible to a lot of the soil-borne pathogens. So when you bed that soil up, it's creating an opportunity for disease to get established. So again, this is a good method, but it's also a bit of a risky one. I prefer things like trunk wraps. So we saw some of the white kind of cardboard ones out in the field yesterday. The one on the far right are the tree teepees that fit around the trunk. And with that one, you can stick your microjet emitter down in there as well. And then I've also seen people cut up pool noodles to fit around the trunks of smaller trees. So all of these are a great way to provide a little extra insulation during a freeze event. But with this one, it's also super important that these go on way before the freeze hits. These work by slowing the drop in temperature. So if it's already 32 degrees and you're putting that wrap on, you've basically you've locked it in at 32 and it's going to continue to decline. Whereas if it's still in the 50s or 60s, it's going to take it much longer to reach those freezing temperatures. And with our commercial guys, the most popular method is microjet sprinklers. And with these, it's really, really important that the water is hitting the graft union, because as long as a little bit of the scion wood survives, the tree can recover. I know we talked a little yesterday that for commercial guys, if it dies all the way back to the scion wood, it's usually not worth it to try and rehabilitate this tree and get it back to a fully producing tree. But for homeowners, a lot of times, like I said, the trees become a part of the family, so you want to do everything you can to save it. I've also seen a lot of people elevate their microjets up on a PVC pipe, so that way the water is hitting the graft union, the rest of the trunk, and as well as some of those lower structural branches, just so you're hitting more of the tree with that protection. And with this method, you usually will lose some of the edges of the canopy where that water's not hitting. But again, if you can save the majority of those structural branches and trunk, the tree is going to have a much better chance of coming back. And it's for that reason we also don't want to do overhead irrigation, because that's going to protect all the edges of your canopy and also add a ton of weight to the tops of your trees. So it just introduces more opportunities for breakage, and then you're also not protecting that graft union. All right, so I've also seen quite a few people use blankets or frost cloth to cover the trees. And again, this one's a bit more popular with homeowners because it's a bit easier to do for a handful of tree versus a couple thousand. And with this, it's again really important to make sure that that protection is going from the top of the tree all the way to the soil. I've seen some people wrap them up like lollipops, and so the trunk stays exposed, and we want to avoid that. So you want to make sure it's being anchored to the ground. And then you can also put electric bulbs or even Christmas lights in the canopy, and that'll provide a little extra heat to help keep things a little warmer inside there. And again, this method works by slowing the drop in temperature. So it's again really important to put that on in advance of the freezing temperatures. And like I mentioned, with potted trees, you're definitely going to want to bring those inside during the winter, especially with potted trees. So because that soil, or because the roots are in a soil in a pot, they don't have the same insulation as a ground planted tree. And so that root zone and that soil is going to be able to cool a whole lot faster than a tree that is actually in the ground. So that whole tree is going to end up being exposed to those freezing temperatures. So you might even get some root damage on the roots. So again, very, very important to bring those trees inside. And as for recovery after a freeze, like we talked about, the varieties differ quite a bit in their freeze susceptibility, or in their cold hardiness, but that also means that they're going to recover at different rates. And even within varieties, or within a tree, the different tissue types are going to vary in their cold hardiness as well. So the flowers tend to be the most susceptible to any cold damage, followed by the tender vegetative flush, and then the fruit, and then the hardened off leaves, and then the woody tissues are going to be the least susceptible to any cold damage. So usually if we see damage from flowers to the hardened off leaves, it sucks to see the tree go through that, but it can usually recover. It's when we start seeing a lot of damage to the wood that the longevity of that tree is going to be shortened. And again, with this woody tissue, so the smaller twigs, like along the edges of the canopy, they're going to be more susceptible than the actual trunk. So the thicker the wood, the more likely it is to survive any cold. But it's when we see those freeze tracks in those structural branches or the trunk that we know that tree is probably never going to fully recover. And like I mentioned before, generally as long as the graft union survives and some of the scion wood, the tree can recover. It may never make it back to 100%, but it should be able to at least get back to a point where it's producing some fruit. And with a lot of the wood damage, it can take quite a while for that damage to become apparent. So it's really important to wait until the spring before doing any sort of cleanup pruning to cut out any of that dead wood, because the dead wood will continue to die back for quite a while. And so when you do prune into the spring, you want to make sure you're cutting into living wood. You don't want to leave any dead wood on the tree. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the freeze recovery and freeze protection. And so I want to spend a few minutes just talking about some common questions I get a lot about what's wrong with my citrus tree, and some of the answers to those kind of questions. So one of the most commons I get is, my tree is dropping a ton of fruit. What's wrong with it? What do I do? And most of the time it's nothing to worry about. Trees do go through 3 periods of natural excision. And the first is at fruit set. And so that's when a lot of those flowers and small fruitlet will fall from the tree. And that's absolutely nothing to worry about. Only about 0.5% to 3% of the flowers are actually going to set a fruit that makes it all the way to harvest. So it's totally normal to see a ton of flowers on the ground, or a lot of these really small, like tic-tac size fruitlets. The next period is June drop, and that'll happen anywhere from May to July, just depending on your area and the variety. And again, this is totally a natural process. This is the tree thinning itself out to a level it can actually support. So I think it's really important to listen to the tree, because if it's telling you, I can only support this many fruit, if you try and push it past that, it's probably not going to end very well in a fruit quality sense. But this period, it's just all these fruit competing for those limited resource, so the weaker ones are kind of pushed out of the competition. And the final period is pre-harvest drop. In healthy trees, this should be pretty minimal, but this is just usually fruit that have reached maturity before a lot of the other fruit, and so the tree's just shedding this older kind of senescing fruit. And again, in healthy trees, shouldn't see too much of that. But if you ever do see a ton of pre-harvest drop, that is usually a sign that we have maybe a bigger issue. Sorry. The other big thing I get a lot is leaf drop. The tree is shedding a lot of leaves. Is it dying? Is it a disease? And again, this is another very natural process. On healthy trees, leaves will live about 18 to 24 months, and they're producing a flush at least 3 times a year. So you should see kind of a shedding of old leaves almost constantly. So it's always normal to see a little bit of leaves on the ground. And down in Florida with greening infected trees, those leaves are only living 6 to 12 months on the tree, so you would see more leaf drop. Sorry, got a little ahead of myself there. Okay. And then kind of the... Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay.
And lastly, this one is one I've gotten a lot this year, is why are my fruits splitting? And this is generally when we have a lot of water right after a long dry spell. And essentially what happens is the juice segments on the inside, they take on a whole lot more water than the peel can expand. So essentially the growth on the inside of the fruit outpaces the peel. And so you do end up splitting wherever there's a weakness in the peel. So again, this is a normal physiological thing. It's not a disease or anything. But usually, I mean, we can't control the rain, but you can kind of cut back on irrigation or watering. Or you just don't want to overdo it if we're having a very, very dry spell right near harvest. Okay, I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the diseases and pests that we see quite a bit, and 2 of these are quarantine diseases that we really, really want to keep out of the state, which is again why it's so important to use our USDA certified nurseries to get our trees. And the first one I'm sure you've heard about from Florida is citrus greening, and it's vectored by the Asian citrus psyllid, which carries the Candidatus Liberibacter asiaticus bacteria, which is the causal agent of citrus greening. And so the psyllid feeds on new flesh, passes that bacteria on, and then it can spread to the rest of the tree, causing a systemic infection. And because this bacteria does take time to move through the trees, you usually have hot spots of infection, which means you also will have hot spots of symptom development. And so to give you an idea, these are 2 pictures from down in Florida. These are the same tree, just 2 different sides of the tree. So you can tell obviously one side is where the infection started and the other one is just now starting to show symptoms. So it's not always this extreme, but with greening you will sometimes see these very localized areas of severe symptoms. And I'm hoping y'all can see it, but we'll kind of go through the timeline here. So this is a healthy satsuma. This would be an asymptomatic tree from down in Florida. So this one would test positive for the disease, but it hasn't started showing symptoms yet. Here's a mild tree. You can just start to see that there's some kind of bare spots in the canopy. It's a little more pale than a healthy tree. And here's a moderate tree. You can tell it's really starting to die off more. There's less fruit, and the fruit it has is really bad quality. They're usually very bitter. They stay green. And then severe, and then eventually pretty much completely dead. There's very little canopy. There's very little fruit. And this whole process can take years to happen. This is not a fast thing, so it can be very misleading because that mild and asymptomatic tree, they look fine. They're still producing fruit. But by the time it's gotten to that point, it's a source of inoculum for other trees in your yard or your neighbor's trees, in a commercial setting, all of the other trees in that grove. So for this disease, the biggest thing to look out for are the psyllids, because they, you'll see those before anything. And they are super duper tiny. So there you can see it at the base of a leaf. And on the far right are the nymphs. They'll leave this waxy white secretion. And so if you see something that looks kind of like really mini confetti, that's from them. And that is just a sign that they have gotten established and are reproducing. So if you ever see anything like that, and so here's some more pictures of the psyllids. Here's one to scale with an orange dog caterpillar. If you ever see anything like the psyllids, please reach out to your local extension agent, and we can kind of come look at it and get an idea of what we're dealing with, because we really want to keep track of where this disease is. So if you see psyllids, the next thing to look for is obviously the symptoms. The easiest one to spot is the blotchy mottling of leaves, and that's going to be characterized by an uneven yellowing. So if you were to fold the leaf across the midrib, the two sides, the yellowing pattern would not match. So here's just a couple examples of what that kind of blotchy mottling can look like. And this symptom can be easy to mix up for other things. So for example, here's our blotchy mottled leaf. You can see one half is showing a lot of yellowing where the other half is still pretty green. And a lot of times nutrient deficiencies can look like blotchy mottling, but with nutrient deficiencies, the yellowing pattern is going to be very symmetrical. The other one that gets mistaken for it a lot is herbicide damage, but that usually forms very distinct yellow polka dot looking pattern. And it's usually the droplets from whatever herbicide was used. So again, very similar, but there are pretty distinct differences. And then the biggest thing is the symptomatic fruit. The fruit's going to be a lot smaller. It's going to be lopsided. It's going to have an off flavor. It's usually going to be a lot paler in color, or maybe even have kind of a brown tinge sometimes. And to be honest, it tastes horrible. I don't know if you remember Florida orange juice from 20 years ago, but it's definitely not the same Florida orange juice we get now. The other big one we're trying to keep out of the state is canker. This one, I would say, arguably spreads easier than citrus greening because it can spread with the wind, rain, equipment, people. If you just brush up against a tree with canker, you can pass that on to somewhere else. So that one spreads super duper easily, and it has very distinct symptoms. It forms these very characteristic cankers on the leaves, stems, even the fruit. And so again, if you ever see anything like this on your tree, please, please, please let your local agent know, because we do want to keep track of where all of this kind of stuff is so we can make sure to keep it under control. And the scary thing with canker is that it has an unfortunate relationship with leaf miners. So I'm sure y'all are all very familiar with leaf miner and the damage they cause. And unfortunately, the canker, the mines, the leaf miner forms, do provide a perfect opening for canker. So a lot of times you will see canker developing on those mines. So again, if you ever see any sort of like brown scabby looking things on your leaf mines, it is cause for concern. Yes, sir.
What are the long-term consequences of the canker?
I mean, the fruit is unsellable. So for commercial reasons, that's really, really bad. It will slowly kill the tree as it can kind of take over, and it will defoliate the tree. So I mean, and it's a much quicker killer than greening. But again, its symptoms are usually right in your face. It's hard to miss it. So it's easier to catch. There are things you can spray to control it, but again, if we ever see it, we'd much rather work on eradicating and keeping it out. We don't want to have to get to a point where we're just trying to manage. And the last kind of big one we see a lot here is Phytophthora. And Phytophthora will affect the roots. So the root rot, and then we have foot rot where it can get into the trunk, and then fruit rot where it's gotten up into the fruit. And so it can move throughout the whole tree, and it will also cause a pretty slow decline. You'll see a lot of yellowing, dieback, and low productivity of these trees. And Phytophthora is one that's just in the soil. If you've got it, you've got it. But it can be managed with fungicide drenches. So it's at least one we can manage. But it's very, very common. And lastly, real quick, I just want to run through some of the insects we see pretty regularly on our citrus, like the aphids and whiteflies, citrus scale, multiple different types, rust mites and other mites, thrips, mealy bugs. I don't know that we've seen those here in Georgia, but I know they had them down in Florida quite a bit. I know we have a huge problem with snails, or at least we're seeing more and more snails. And then katydids, I know I've seen from a lot of folks them feeding on fruit and causing damage that way. Same with the leaf-footed bugs. They are getting on the trees and they can puncture the fruit and kind of create an opportunity for disease to get in. And then with orange dog caterpillars, you wouldn't believe that they could defoliate a tree, but they will eat up a tree very quickly. And then again, I don't think we've seen too many of these here, but the grasshoppers can do the same kind of thing and eat up the tree. And as for future resources, we do have a UJ Citrus blog where we post updates of all of the research going on and just the happenings in the citrus world. We also have diagnostic clinics for our Georgia folks where you can submit samples for any of our diseases to help identify. And if all else fails, the University of Florida has a ton of really great resources for citrus, and so it can be a good place to start on figuring out what's going on. And so with that, I really appreciate y'all letting me come and talk. I don't know if I have any time for questions, probably not, but thank y'all.
Yeah, any questions? Maybe got time for two. I see two hands, perfect.
Is there any cold hardy and like disease resistant, pest resistant varieties for
I wish, so the question was if there's any cold hardy, disease resistant, pest resistant trees. I wish. There's not like this silver bullet of a tree that's just resistant to absolutely everything. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what about beneficial fungus, which is usually has to be inoculated there at the initial planting time? You didn't mention anything like that.
And I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with that. I've seen beneficial fungus on some trees in the state. It was not intentionally inoculated. So I haven't really heard of, at least on a commercial scale, people doing that.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thank y'all.